Rutted Reviews, and today it is the 14th of December, and we continue on with the 2020 Advent Calendar of Christmas horror movies. Now, every time I go down this road with the Advent Calendar, every year, I encounter in one form or another the question, what constitutes a Christmas horror movie? And I'll be honest, I really do try to focus on movies where Christmas is an integral part of the storyline or the plot, but there are a finite number of movies out there. This is my third year running, which means sometimes you just have to go with those tenuous little strings, and if it has a Christmas tree in the background, latch onto it. That's a Christmas horror movie. And sometimes that kind of comes in the form of a particular segment, especially when we're talking about movies that are compilations or anthologies. Last year, on Christmas Eve, I covered the anthology movie Tales from the Third Dimension, which had just the most wackadoo Christmas segment at the end, and I highly recommend anybody check that out. But this year, I'm taking a slightly different approach, and I am including an anthology only because one segment is Christmas, and instead of doing something more modern like that, I'm actually kind of going back in time. Now, if you followed my channel for any considerable period of time, you would know that I have a strong love for Amicus anthology films, the Peter Cushing classics and so forth from the late 60s through the mid 70s, Tales from the Crypt, so on and so forth. And this time, I'm actually even going back further than that, to the 1945 movie Dead of Night. As far as why I picked this one outside of the very flimsy Christmas excuse, I actually have been wanting to watch this for a very long time, and I've just never really gotten around to it. I love classics such as this, and this movie really delivered in a big way some scares that I really wasn't expecting. Usually, I'll be honest, when we get movies like this, when we go back to the classics and so forth, I appreciate them for what they had, and I watch them with a timeline context and so forth, but scary? I mean, let's be honest, not so much anymore. But in this case, this had some elements of it that actually kind of shook me just a little bit. I'm not going to go ahead and make the claim that it was frightening as all get out, but it definitely crossed some lines that I was not expecting for a 1945 movie. And so this movie opens up, as a lot of anthologies do, with the binding segment, the thing that gets the ball rolling as far as telling the other tales. And in this case, it's an architect that is invited to visit a small farmhouse outside of Kent, and he's kind of brought into this group of people and so forth while he kind of takes a look at the architecture. And there's just some socialization going on, but he is obviously distracted. There's something on his mind. He's being introduced to these people, and it's just, oh, yeah, nice, good to meet you, so on. And it finally comes out that all of the people that he is meeting right now, he has met before in his dreams. And I love that in movies of this era and so forth, they can just go ahead and say that with absolute candor. And it's just, oh, really? Well, please tell us more. And it's a delightful kind of just acceptance of the fact and moving on. Good for you. Please indulge us, that kind of thing. Whereas, today they would actually require some further examination and some incredulousness from other characters towards the veracity of the story. But regardless, moving on, that's basically how this happens, is he describes how he's been in this situation before. In his dreams, he just kind of barely consciously remembers it. It's that kind of thing where you just it slips through your fingers the more you try to think about it, the waking up after a nightmare kind of thing. But it's enough residual memory that all of this seems familiar. And the characters kind of start to tell their tales one by one because all of them have had something peculiar happen to them in their lives. Hence, the segments. And the segments in this are the hearse driver, the Christmas party, the haunted mirror, the golfer's story, and the ventriloquist dummy. And the hearse driver is probably the one that's going to seem the most familiar. It's based off of an older E.F. Benson story that was published in the Pall Mall magazine in 1906 called The Bus Conductor. And Twilight Zone episodes and so forth have been made for it, room for one more, that kind of thing. It's a familiar story, but it was still done very well in this particular case. It really It was pretty creepy in some fashion, especially just the way that the actual character of the hearse driver was talking to the character. The Christmas party is, well, it's kind of the reason that I'm standing here in front of the screen today and not next month. And I thought it worked reasonably well for a pretty softball ghost story for the most part. There wasn't really anything terribly scary about it. It just kind of, the nature of, that person that I was talking to was a ghost, shivers. But still told very well. I actually liked the entirety of the segment there. It had a very interesting kind of charm and feel to it. I had no problem with this one. The Haunted Mirror, I liked. I didn't really dislike it, but I do think that it went on too long. It would actually probably could have been cut in half. And there was an element of it that it came to a point in which I really thought I could see the conclusion coming. And the one that I developed in my head as far as trying to figure out what would happen was way scarier than the one that wound up happening 10 minutes later. But in order for mine to have worked, it really wouldn't have worked within the logic of the storyline, because the logic of the storyline dictates that the person telling the tale has to live to tell the tale. And in my version, that wouldn't have been the case. So I could see why, that didn't really pan out and they had to continue it along and so forth and come up with the resolution they did. It still just felt a bit stretched out. The golfer story, I just didn't care for at all. I didn't really realize until it was probably about midway through that this wasn't even trying to be scary. It was actually trying to have a little bit of comedic levity, breaking the tension throughout. That really hammered home when it was all concluded and went back to the binding storyline when they were talking about it and so forth. But for me, it just felt weirdly out of place, and I really couldn't quite understand exactly what I was watching and why I was watching it. Some of the comedy of this era is timeless. Some of it not so much. And in this case, I don't think it really aged that well. It was basically two characters that were fighting over a woman who wanted them both equally, and everybody was at an impasse, so they tried to decide what to do. And, well, you might think maybe you should die. No, I think maybe you should. Well, why don't we decide over a round of golf? Okay. And then the round of golf concluded, and, well, the loser basically, okay, and off into the river he walked to drown himself, and so on. It was not nearly as funny and as charming to me as I believe audiences found it back in 1945. That one I really could have just left behind. And the ventriloquist dummy, it was told extremely well in this, but again, it's like the hearse driver, it's a familiar tale by this point, where you have the ventriloquist and his dummy, and it's a very convincing act, but the more people start to look behind the scenes, the more the line blurs between what's the performance and the nature of the relationship between the ventriloquist and his dummy, i.e., how alive is this damned wooden thing? This was an extraordinary movie in a lot of ways, and I really appreciate a lot of what it put out there and influenced in the future. There really were not a lot of horror movies from Britain in the 1940s, mostly because they were banned from production during the war. So it wasn't until after the war wrapped up that they were able to start making them again. So there's a lot of catching up that had to happen there. Britain, obviously being in the war far longer than we were, they had a big gap between the times that they were able to do things like this, and they were ready to hit the ground running with this new camera technology, this new special effects, filming techniques, and so forth. And I think that this was a shining example of pulling off a lot of good performances and terror. Because just like any good story signing off with a flourish, the real gem of this is how it ends. Everything coming together, the binding storyline doing its wrap up, and that's the moment in which I think the real creepiness set in. I would say that although this movie didn't scare me to my core, the elements that did scare me the most were towards the end of this movie, and it was just a hell of a punctuation mark on it. So if you're like me and you like to watch the classics and kind of learn a lot of the origins as far as the modern scares that we enjoy now, how they started out and developed over the decades, as well as if you like anthologies, especially Amicus anthologies, I strongly recommend the 1945 movie Dead of Night. Thank you so much for watching here. I really appreciate the viewership, and if you like this, please click subscribe. It really helps me out a lot. Remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.